This is the America's Quarterly Podcast. I'm Brian Winter. After 9 months in office, Javier Milei's government has successfully slashed the budget and brought down inflation. But the economy itself is still struggling. On today's episode, an overview of what's working and what's not in Javier Milei's Argentina.
What this government has proven is that the social resistance was not there. Maybe this is something new, because people understood finally that we needed to adjust and there was a precondition for everything else.
During his campaign, Javier Milei said he would take a chainsaw to government spending in Argentina. Well, 9 months after taking office, it's clear that man was not kidding. He has made deep spending cuts. In fact, it's the biggest fiscal adjustment in Argentina in at least 65 years, according to a recent study by the Fundación Mediterránea, a think tank. This has contributed to some positive effects for the Argentine economy. Inflation that was running at about 10% a month for much of last year is now down to about 4% a month. President Milei's approval rating has also been steady at about 50%, as Argentines still believe that his recipe for shock therapy will ultimately reverse many years of economic crisis and decline. But at the same time, poverty is up, at least for now, and the economy is expected by the IMF to contract 3.5% this year. And the question everybody has, whether it's investors, foreign governments, or everyday Argentines, is when will Argentina's economy start to recover? When will investment and growth begin to rebound? So today we thought we'd look past some of the political rhetoric and hype and try to take a good, balanced look at Argentina's economy. To do so, we have a great guest, our friend and AQ editorial board member, Eduardo Levy Yeyati, a former chief economist of Argentina's Central Bank. He is a full professor at the School of Government at Torcuato di Tella University in Buenos Aires. Eduardo has just written a piece for us about what he calls today's politics of emotion and the need to bring politics back to the center, focus on results. We'll talk about that article here as well. Eduardo, welcome back to the AQ Podcast.
Thank you for the invitation. It's always a pleasure.
Eduardo, it's been about 9 months now since Javier Milei took office. What is your overall assessment of Argentina's economy today?
This is a complex question because there is a difference between what you see and read and what's actually happening, as usual, but more so now because this government is very present in the news and in social networks. But there is some novelty in Argentine economics in particular. You have to bear in mind that Milei, as a president and as a public intellectual, is very much concentrated on economic issues. Now, having said that, the key novelty for me is that the government had been faithful to its beliefs much more than people thought originally. So typically you're in the middle of the campaign and you promise different stuff, reforms, changes that are presumably popular, and then you do something completely different. This is not necessarily the case. I think that this is something new for Argentine politics. And this is good and bad. I mean, it's good because the government have focused almost exclusively in the economy, and that was much needed. Milei seems to care much less about everything else. And particularly, they have centered on the fiscal deficit and with a strong conviction, meaning the guy actually thinks that this is the beginning and the end of the resolution of Argentine crisis. And he expresses this with such a conviction it becomes credible, where credibility was always historically a problem. I would say that would be the main novelty here. I want to emphasize this because I'm not sure any other candidate could have done this like him.
Well, so let's talk a little bit about the fiscal situation. I saw a headline in the Argentine press this week saying that the fiscal adjustment that Milei has pushed through is the biggest in more than 60 years in terms of percentage of GDP. The data also show that they are managing a fiscal surplus. That's not a primary surplus, that's an actual nominal surplus, including interest payments on the debt, something that nobody thought was possible. And, you talk about what he said during the campaign. This was a guy who famously wielded a chainsaw and who was ripping the names of ministries off of a wall. Everybody remembers those images. So it is consistent with what he was saying during the campaign. So I guess my question is, why, in the context of Argentina's recent history, was this a surprise?
Well, everybody knew that they had fiscal problem, and there was usually the belief that either because of a lack of social or political space, or simply because there was some minimal inertia in the way public spending in particular was distributed, that this was not feasible. And what this government has proven is that the social resistance was not there. Maybe this is something new, because people understood finally that we needed to adjust and there was a precondition for everything else. And the political opposition is completely dismantled. And many of the previous political references, I think, are, I wouldn't say obsolete, but they lack the political support. They don't get votes right now. So, there is no organized political resistance or opposition. And also, they found ways to reduce, say, the public sector payroll beyond what people, specialists, experts, thought it was possible. So there was that space, actually. And they went through, this is like a chicken game where one of the drivers had their hands tied to the wheel. Milei has and shows that his hands are tied to the wheel. And that all of a sudden becomes credible and feasible, where people thought that there was no way to do this, at least not that fast. So it was surprising in more than one way.
Because of Argentina's recent history, many of us believed that if he came in with this kind of, agenda, that he might not last 6 months on the job before there was a popular revolt. But in practice, as you know, something very different has happened. His popularity in some polls, in fact, is unchanged at around 50%. Do you think that is more a credit to him as a communicator, or does it speak to just the way that the Peronist opposition was just so completely discredited that society has given him the latitude to do these things?
I think both. First of all, a disclaimer, right? I mean, you know that economists have the tendency to answer every question, including the ones, particularly the ones they don't know anything about. So this question is not strictly economic in nature. But having said that, I believe that first, what we read about society was produced somewhere else. It was produced by journalists or thinkers. They were somewhat disconnected with the new generations, a majority of which actually supported Milei. Politicians in particular, but also intellectuals, they talk to each other. They talk to old people, or they talk to politicians, or they talk to people that are self-interested in the way they express their opinions. But they struggle to find a way to communicate to the new generations that are increasingly the majority of voters. And that's something that came very much to the foreground during the campaign, because at the beginning it was a surprise, but then you start analyzing the nature, the way in which Milei's voters think. And in fact, they have been there all the time, except that nobody was actually listening to them. Milei somehow, maybe intuitively, maybe because he was to some extent one of them, talked to them in a more direct way and actually communicated with them in a way that no traditional politician now could do. In fact, one problem that I see in the opposition, and something actually we talk about in a recent piece in America's Quarterly, is that there seems to be a lack of reference that have a way to communicate with is increasingly the majority of voters. And without that communication, liberal democracy simply doesn't work well. And that's something that was exposed during last campaign and is still there. People were expecting that the voter would start to change their mind as the cost of the adjustment started to manifest themselves, but that's actually not working. That said, half of the population is anti-Milei. It's not that everybody is in favor of him. but his 40 to 50% support is still very resilient, despite these 9 months that have been relatively difficult 9 months.
So we've spoken at some length about the fiscal situation, about how Milei has managed to maintain a certain consensus around those cuts. Let's talk about another really important barometer for Argentina, maybe the most important one, which is inflation. The month that Milei took office, inflation was running at about a 25% monthly rate. Over the last couple of months, that has been closer to 4. That suggests maybe some stagnation in that fight. I mean, look, I want to be fair here. Going from 25 to 4 is pretty dramatic, but for it to come down further is going to be tough. So can you put your economist hat back on, if you will, and unpack for us a little bit what's happening with inflation right now, and if there's any hope of it coming down further from this level that, again, it's about 50% on an annualized basis?
First of all, we have to take the official rhetoric with caution, right? I mean, the 25% was an epiphenomenon, was something that only happened 1 month following a dramatic, unexpected exchange rate correction. And on top of that, a liberalization of many prices have been contained before. So they tried to, my impression is they tried to front load inflation so that they can actually attribute that to the previous government. So the reference point is probably 10%, around 10%. That was the inertia before. So what happened? Well, first of all, the government would say the fiscal deficit, the elimination of fiscal deficit, eliminated a source of monetary printing. There was the transfers from the central bank to the treasury to finance that deficit. And that by itself, plus some certain degree of credibility, brought down inflation inertia from 10 to 4. What happened is a mix of this explanation and something more real. The fiscal adjustment actually created a recession. The decline in aggregate demand created a recession. The recession actually pushed down, business markups and prices in general. And on top of that, the government has been using and abusing the old exchange rate anchor that's typical of Argentine anti-inflationary economics. In Argentina, because you lack credibility, people look at the dollar as a reference to change prices. And politicians, because they lack monetary policy or a credible framework to attack inflation, they use the exchange rate. They depress artificially the exchange rate to lower inflation expectations. So you put together the contraction, the recession, and the exchange rate misalignment or the exchange rate overvaluation, and that probably explains a significant part of the decline. That part is transitory. So the real question is, what would be inflation if we were growing and we had exchange rate moving with prices freely? Probably would be a couple of points higher. So there was some achievement, but part of this number is artificially depressed by those two factors that I just mentioned.
Inflation is no doubt, it's an important measure. It has a huge impact on people's day-to-day lives. Ultimately, though, for this experiment to work, the real economy is going to have to start growing again. And the recession that the country has endured over these last 9+ months has been very severe. I mean, that's how you get to a decline in inflation like this. What are you seeing in terms of the real economy, and how far away are we from that, reactivation that so many people, including obviously Javier Milei and his economic team, are hoping for?
Well, remember that I started by saying that there were good and bad things related to the fiscal obsession, Milei. The bad thing is that because they believe that the fiscal deficit is the sole, or almost the sole cause of everything wrong in the Argentine economy, they focused on adjusting the fiscal deficit and expected the private sector to make up for the decline in demand, and everything coming into place just because the deficit was no longer there. That Milei sincerely rely on the fiscal adjustment for growth. I don't think that's going to happen. The private sector is still hesitating, in part because nobody wants to invest in a country that is in a recession, in part because the exchange rate is perceived, even if it's not really overvalued, it's perceived to be overvalued. So nobody wants to buy Argentine stuff and will wait until the exchange rate corrects itself. And we still have exchange rate controls, the so-called CEPO. And we still have export taxes and import taxes because we have now a tax on purchases of foreign exchange for imports. So in that environment, it's not clear where the driving force for the recovery of the real economy will come from. There are investments in extractive sectors, oil and gas, mining, that have very partial trickle down into real economy, but it will come and will get their dollars. And apart from that, and some very generous investment promotion plans, it's not clear where the engine of the economy will come. If we can sustain this exchange rate and engineer a growth recovery next year, this might be a perfect victory. If not, we might face a crisis pretty much like the one we faced in 2018 or 19.
This is the thing. Some people don't realize from the outside is that Argentina is expensive again, not just if you go as a tourist, but if you're looking to make the kinds of investments that are necessary if they're going to come from abroad. Part of this is because of this gap again that we've seen that was a characteristic of the Kirchnerista years as well, the gap between the official exchange rate and I guess you could say the real exchange rate. This has led to speculation that this government might have to devalue again. Milei and his government team have said in public and in private that they will not devalue. Do you believe them?
Yes, I believe what he says. Now, he may be wrong. I don't think he's tricking us into believing that the fiscal deficit will actually sort everything out. Like, it's an old-fashioned supply side, let's put it in American terms. I do believe that he will stick to the exchange rate anchor. In this case, it's a crawling peg. The exchange rate, the official exchange rate is actually going up by 2% per month, although inflation is around 4%, 3.5%. And I also believe that he will stick to that simply because inflation is the only key victory that he can show next year. Next year is an election year. Right? It's a midterm election year. And he will use the declining inflation as the best good result he can show because growth probably will still not be there. So he will be betting increasingly on just one factor and exposing Argentina to external shocks or real shocks like a draft.
We'll be back after a short break. It is the event of the year in Miami for investors and business leaders who are interested in Latin America. The Council of the Americas Symposium and Bravo Business Awards will be held this year on October 30th. This year's honorees include Paula Santilli, the CEO of PepsiCo Latin America, Martin Migoya, the co-founder and CEO of Globant, who will receive an award on behalf of his company, and many more. For more information, have a look at the Council of the Americas website. That's as-coa.org. You mentioned this view that Milei is depending too much, essentially, on fiscal policy to do the work of turning around Argentina's economy. That is a view I've heard elsewhere. In your mind, what is the most urgent reform that is still necessary to turn the economy around, whether it's on his wish list or not? What do you see as kind of the most important politically viable steps that could be taken to ensure that this turnaround really does take hold?
There are two things related to that question. The first one is we still have to sort out our macroeconomic crisis. We still haven't stabilized because people are still expecting the exchange rate to go up. And if that happens, you will have another peak on inflation. You have to manage that. It's not impossible to manage, but you still have to sort of work your way around that inflation and bring it down back to, say, 2%, eventually single digits annually. So you haven't done the job, the first job, which is stabilizing. Without stabilization, any other reform will fail. Now, once you do that, there are a number of reforms that have been on the list for ages. The tax reform, for sure. We have a a tax system that is populated by a number of useless taxes. We need to have, as soon as possible, a social security reform because we have universal pensions in Argentina by law since 2016. And we have an increasing degree of informality. So nobody's actually contributing to the system. Everybody's getting something out of that. So sooner or later, that coupled with the demographics of Asian will open up again that deficit. We need to engineer some social security reform. And I would add there probably the labor reform because you don't want to have 70% of your private workforce working informally or independently. You want to create good jobs. And the current labor regulation is actually outdated and probably one of the many barriers creating these good jobs that we so badly need. So those are the three that I would put top of the line. You see, that it's not simple, but we need to start thinking about that for the day after.
It's quite the list and testimony to many accumulated years of economic dysfunction in Argentina. What do you hear from members of Argentina's private sector? You have some business leaders like Marcos Galperin, the Mercado Libre founder, who have been very positive in public. Behind closed doors, what are business leaders generally saying?
Well, there are always winners and losers. Marcos Galperin is one clear winner. But the industrial sector in particular, and some SMEs, small and medium enterprises, and micro enterprises are suffering from inflation, from the lack of deregulation. Although the government actually try to deregulate some of these markets, in particular the lack of competition. In Argentina, only the agricultural sector is actually competitive. So you have a lot of monopolists and oligopolists that are actually benefiting from their power, the market power and the political power at the expense of a number of small enterprises are the ones that are ultimately the ones that are in charge of creating new jobs and distributing income population. So the big guys, the winners probably are very vocally in favor of the government. The losers are cautiously critical of the government. And then there are a number of voices that are not even represented in the debate that are, to a large extent, probably suffering the transition.
So we've been kind of dancing around this a little bit, but let me try to inspire a little bit of a moment of truth here. Where do you think Argentina's economy will be 1 year from now?
If I wanted to be popular and grab a headline, I would say this time we're going to be growing by 7%, or alternatively, because it's completely, doesn't make any difference, or we will have a crisis next year, like in 2019. Both titles, both propositions would be attractive from a media perspective. But I believe they will be pretty much what we are right now, meaning the government will not budge, will not change directions. We will have a problem with the exchange rate. We will have a problem to get more money, net money, from the fund, although probably we will roll over the program eventually sometime next year. We will have problems to rebound as we should, because we have been coming down for a long time, and this year is going to be particularly bad. So we need to grow by 5, 6, 7% a couple of years only to recover the lost ground. I don't see that happening. So my answer is the most uninteresting one. It's going to be pretty much where we are right now. And if you ask me politically, I think Milei will defeat the opposition because the opposition is not there. He's the only player in the field. And even if he loses some support, he'll still be the winner of whatever context the next year election represents. What you see is probably going to stay the same at least for next year.
Eduardo, that answer may reinforce a little bit why you wrote this recent piece for America's Quarterly about the need for a new centrist agenda in Latin America. What inspired you to write this piece, which you co-authored for us with Mauricio Cárdenas, the former Colombian finance minister, who is now a professor here at Columbia University in New York? What inspired you guys to write this?
We are old-fashioned. That's the first thing to note. We were used to political parties and political debates around the center. The center doesn't exist. It's a zero measure point in the distribution, right? It's just something as a mythical place. The center is where people at the right and left gather around to discuss policies that have some resilience to a changing government, which is something, and in particular in Argentina, but in Latin America in general, creates probably one of the greatest disincentives for growth. Because if you know that things will change, the rules of the game will be changing every 4 years in the case of Argentina, every 6 years in other cases, then it's very hard for investors, for the private sector, to actually make long-run plans and investment. Investment per se, except the most extractive investment, is a long-run plan. So we were used to that, and now we are missing that scene, that space. What we see is a lot of negative identification. People vote a lot, in Argentina in particular, against the other. It's not that I really like Milei, but I will never vote for Massa, and vice versa, right? So, and that means that you're not contributing to a debate pro some measures, but you're essentially trying to destroy something that you think is wrong for the country. And that destructive dialectics is in part what explains why our countries have been so disappointing, in particular Argentina, but I'm thinking also of Colombia or Chile recently. Milei fails and is replaced by a Milei of a different sign, we will still be in the same mess as ever. So we're trying to have people come back to a center to negotiate something that has more than 40 years of life. But that was the inspiration. Without that, our democracies will continuously weaken and will eventually be authoritarian or illiberal democracies.
So I think that there's clear evidence that governments who, they might not call themselves centrist, you might call them center left or center right, but there are lots of examples of governments that have gotten the kinds of enduring results that you're talking about. You mentioned in your article, Uruguay is still a place where you see a good bit of center-ish leadership. I think of leaders like Michelle Bachelet in Chile. I would actually make an argument that Lula's governments have had center-ish elements to them from time to time. But I can also, as I say this, I can sense part of our audience rolling their eyes a little bit because centrism, as you note in your article, has become unfashionable or old-fashioned. I believe you described yourself even just now. Why is that?
First of all, it's true that, as I said before, the center doesn't exist. We're talking about but the examples that you mentioned, Uruguay, Chile, at the time of the consultation, Bachelet, but also the center right of Chile 10 years ago, and Lula with his alliance with Alkin. They are the exceptions to the rule, so to speak. You don't see that generally. You see that as an exception. To the audience, I don't know what to say, really. I mean, it's true. It's unfashionable, but, this is politics. This is not fashion. So we have to think more rationally and see where are we failing, failing opportunities. Why decade after decade we are discussing about the lost decades of Latin America. We're still writing about that, or the middle income trap that we cannot get out of. I mean, Latin America is the only region where we have poor countries that are also democratic. So we have to find a way to keep being democratic and get out of the middle income trap. And that's only through the center, somewhere around the center.
Well, but look, you mentioned Latin America's challenges, and fair enough, that's what we do here on this podcast. But let's also be honest. I mean, this migration of people to the ideological poles is something that we've seen all over the democratic world in the last 10, 15 years. This has been analyzed at length by others. Social media is a big part of it. It's not the only reason, though. So that said, my final question for you, and I would encourage our audience to go read the piece on the America's Quarterly website. But in just, in a nutshell, how can centrists in your mind compete with the adrenaline boost and that shot of righteous anger that often accompanies being on either side of those ideological poles and is part of what makes them so attractive?
Well, the first thing to note is that this is a personal statement, but I wouldn't vote for many of my centrist references myself. I think they're obsolete, they're old, they don't. At some point, I have the feeling that they don't care about the voter anymore. They have been doing. It's like, there is a very nice, probably not so good, but nice Warren Beatty movie. It's called Woolworth, in which you have a formerly radical Democratic senator completely burnt out to lobbyists. I mean, he's a has-been in terms of a politician. Well, many of our politicians are just going through the numbers without any conviction. Those guys are not going to revive the center unless they change, which is unlikely. You have to find new reference, new, younger references with a new way of thinking. You have to not think out of the box, but create a new box. And that's difficult to propose to politicians because they actually like being there. And they do believe that they have the votes and the support, which they lost time ago.
Maybe part of the problem is that centrism so often feels like a defense of the status quo. And, there's no attempt to appeal to people's emotions and recognize what's wrong with their day-to-day lives. Do you believe that's at least partly true?
Absolutely. I think centrism, which doesn't exist per se, was the space of reformism, where people that actually wanted to change the system within the system instead of just revolutionizing everything and bringing down governments. That was the origin of the center. The center was reformist. But now, after so many years, and a good deal of failures, the same guys are sort of they gave up on reform and novelty and change, but they're still there, crowding out the new people. And that's part of what happened in the center. They're crowding out. The old people are crowding out the new people. They don't want to go anywhere, but they want to share their power, their square meter, a shrinking square meter of power. So it has a lot to do with the politicians, the fact that the center has lost appeal, because it's an objective truth that they simply don't seem to care, and probably they don't care about the voter, but they expect the voter to keep voting for them because they are the old guys, the guys that have been there forever. Doesn't have any sense. And in fact, the fact that you have such a rapid generational change in the voting base is actually one key natural reason why these guys have been retired prematurely. They still don't know that, but they're retired. So that's not bad or good. It's just a natural way in which politics evolve. So you have to let it happen. Once you have new faces that can recognize the demand for these new voters, then the connection is more natural. It's not a format. It's not you don't have to go to the TV, you have to use a streaming device or go to the social network. That's easily done. It's the fact that you have to have someone that has at least a minimal connection with the demands of the new voters. That still is not there.
Well, for more, I would encourage our readers to find this article. It's entitled Imagining a Centrist Revival in Latin America. Eduardo, thank you so much for joining us today on the AQ Podcast.
It's a great pleasure as usual.
Thank you for listening to the America's Quarterly Podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, please leave us a review, give us a rating, and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. The America's Quarterly Podcast is produced and edited by Luisa Franco. Our sound engineer is Gabriela Baez.